Hey everyone, this is Liz Brassoff from Thrust Flight, and I'm the Chief Flight Instructor here. Today we're going to talk about common ways to fail your commercial pilot check ride. So when I think about what leads commercial pilot applicants to be unsuccessful on check ride day, really one phrase comes to mind, and it's they fly like a private pilot. So let's talk a little bit about what that actually means. Why would I say fly like a private versus fly like a commercial leads to failing your check ride? I'll give you a few examples from my time working as a flight instructor, even before Thrust Flight and here, just trends I've noticed for students who go through this exam. We've had students who have left their feet on the brakes for the whole taxi portion, right? Riding the brakes. The examiners are not happy about that, and that's not operating as a commercial pilot that day. So that might not be the actual item the examiner tells you, we're done here, that's unsatisfactory, but it definitely contributes to the overall outcome on your check ride. That you have not instilled confidence in this examiner that you could be the commercial pilot. You could do this for hire now, right? That's the big change is I am a professional in the industry versus I'm an individual that can carry family and friends, right? So as you think about that and all the flying tasks that you'll do on the check ride, that's really what they're looking for, is that escalation from private skill and ability, knowledge, reasoning, right, to commercial pilot level. You could do this for hire. We could trust you with the general public now being your passengers. So other examples of that, I would say, come to like flying into the traffic pattern and entering an airport. On the commercial pilot check ride, you start on a cross country. The examiner gives you a diversion. Maybe it's inclement weather, maybe they're not feeling well, maybe they just flat out say, I need you to divert, right? And they tell you an airport to go to or tell you the nearest airport, right? Find the nearest one and divert there. Anyways, I've got private pilots who succeed on their check rides with a similar skill, and I would say they are barely keeping pace with the airplane, right? Like they don't have to be multiple steps ahead because the stakes are lower. On a commercial pilot check ride, there's no wiggle room, right? If you're unable to get the wind direction or you determine the wrong runway to be able to use for that airport for the current conditions, maybe you're putting yourself right on top of the airspace before making a call to enter that airport, the examiner again is gonna hold you to a pretty high standard because now you're trying to test for the commercial level, being a professional in the industry, and that's not how you'd professionally fly that aircraft. So the standards are a little bit more stringent there, and especially on the overall picture you're giving on your abilities. Hopefully though, that gives you a little bit more insight, a couple of those real world examples on where examiners have shared, hey, this was not meeting commercial pilot standards or skill, and that's what we needed to show today. So like I said, some of those may have seemed small, but they compile to make the larger decision for your check ride outcome. Power off 180s are often a commonly failed item on this check ride. That's one of the performance landings that you'll test on as a commercial pilot applicant. So you'll do short field and soft field just like you did on the private pilot exam, and you're also supposed to do a landing called the power off 180. So this landing can be difficult, especially if you haven't practiced it enough. I think with enough practice, you can go in feeling confident for the day you're flying in, but it's a maneuver that's largely dependent on the outside conditions. And I think, again, that leads to why it requires higher skill and why so many students fail on this item on their check ride. Because if you only practice it on days with a 10-knot headwind with your instructor and your check ride day has 5-knot tailwind or perhaps a crosswind, then it's totally changed how that maneuver goes in your airplane. How much it floats or sinks and what's needed to actually meet the target of the maneuver, which is to land at a very specific point on the runway. So that's a tough one. That means you had to have practiced this in a variety of weather conditions. You needed to practice it in multiple weight configurations because your examiner and your DPE might not weigh the same. The amount of fuel you had on board on the test day might not have been the same. And all of that can impact how that maneuver actually turns out. So largely, I think students need to have more exposure practice to it when they become unsuccessful on a check ride on that maneuver. It's not that they don't have the skill, it's just they haven't built enough proficiency with that skill or again, practice in enough varying conditions. Don't make the same mistake, right? You can practice the Power Off 180 many times before you go in and then you know you'll feel confident and succeed on that maneuver that day. In the oral portion, really similar thoughts or trends become apparent as you work with multiple commercial pilot applicants. If the examiner is asking about some basic level knowledge and you're unable to show that you've escalated escalated the knowledge base you had from private to commercial, it can mean an unsuccessful check ride day. So again, I'll give you some examples to hopefully make that point a little bit more clear. On the oral portion, you have to bring a prepared cross-country flight plan or a navigation log, and the examiner's going to ask you some questions about how you found those numbers, how they differ on another day, a hotter day, a higher density altitude day, maybe with the winds from a different direction or a different velocity, and you'd have to be able to explain how that would affect your flight. At a private pilot level, maybe you're able to tell me it'll take longer, right? Or we'll burn more fuel. At the commercial pilot level, we might start asking, well, how much longer? How much more fuel? Let's say you planned this cross country is going to take this many gallons, blah, 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 right? And I say, okay, I've got a little wrinkle for you. I showed up with 50 pounds more baggage than I told you I was coming with, right? How can we make this scenario successful? How can we get me to where I need to go as your paying customer? That's all stuff you would have to be able to reason through and get the appropriate answer for. The answer is not leave my bags behind, right? Because I'm your paying customer. Maybe it is an option, but usually the answer is that we're going to recalculate our navigation log, plan a fuel stop if needed, or take out more fuel. We had more than we needed to make it to the destination, and we're going to now just take it to the minimum reserve that I feel comfortable with. And what is that for my personal minimums, right? Maybe they're asking about some calculations with the airspeeds, true airspeed versus ground speed, the differences there. Well, what if this one was higher or lower? Or why aren't they the same thing as your indicated airspeed on your nav log? If the student barely shows an understanding of the memorized definitions of those airspeeds, indicated true airspeed and ground speed, or maybe variation versus deviation, then I think it's a cue to the examiner of, I'm not sure you really understand this, or that we're at a very basic level of understanding and I need to see how you can apply this, because it is a higher standard you're being tested to as a commercial pilot. Sometimes, again, that can lead to an unsuccessful check ride if the student's unable to dig any deeper than that. If I can only tell you the memorized definition of true airspeed, and then you ask me some things like what would influence true airspeed on a given day, or what would change that number, and I can't answer, then we're gonna have some issues as we progress through the oral exam. In general, on the oral, I would say the cross-country flight planning, right, or maybe the performance and limitations section is usually a pretty big emphasis point for examiners, and they find some deficiencies there fairly often in students. Airworthiness seems to be another really big scenario that students manifest weaknesses in if they haven't escalated their knowledge from private to commercial. Airworthiness can get a little bit sticky depending on the airplane you're bringing to your check ride. I mean, like I said, that could be a whole nother video we could do, but it needs to be applicable to the airplane you're bringing to the exam that day. And so this is where, again, I see differences between I'm at the private pilot level knowledge and I've escalated to the commercial pilot level knowledge. If I can't talk about, well, I've got a full glass airplane and here's how I could determine what cooling fans are necessary to be airworthy, versus this is what I memorized out of the FARs and it was written for any airplane from the year, 1965 to today. It's just not specific enough. Or maybe with airworthiness directives or items like that, I've got the name memorized, but I couldn't explain it more, or I didn't know there were any for my airplane, or other specifics like that. That's really the depth a commercial pilot needs to be able to go to, because hopefully the doors are open. You could get hired to fly a lot of other airplanes, and that's what the examiner needs to know, is that you've got a good enough foundation that you could answer questions like this when the stakes are on, when you've got passengers for hire, when you've been hired to fly an aircraft that maybe you're still becoming familiar with. You need to have a good foundation on the regs and how to determine when you're legal or not legal to go. I bet you could guess the next item we see a lot of students struggle with on commercial pilot check rides: the commercial pilot privileges. You have a whole new set of rules you have to operate under, and really having a solid and good understanding of that is needed to pass the commercial pilot check ride. So there's an entire advisory circular written about commercial pilot privileges for Part 91 operations, which is really what your examiner typically hones in on your commercial pilot check ride. And if I haven't studied that document or have barely scratched the surface on what I can or can't do as a commercial pilot, it's not going to be a very smooth check ride day. So that's an area that's easily missed by students if they haven't spent the time to learn it deep enough. That about wraps up today's video on common ways to fail your commercial pilot check ride. If you have a question, leave us a comment, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on future videos.